What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about some new lists from the brand new Aeldari Codex. This past weekend, many GT's large 5-round events from the community used the Aeldari Codex, and so we had a pretty wide selection of armies that did fairly well. And so what I'm going to be doing today is talking about armies from several different detachments in the faction that saw at least a 4-1 result in tournaments from this weekend. Now, first, we're going to talk about some 5-0 result. Starting with the Brighton GT, a 21-player event held in the United Kingdom. The event was won by Dami Segun, who was running an Aspect Host. Now, I want to start with this detachment because I think it's likely to be the most common detachment that we see from this faction, at least for the next couple of weeks while players are still sussing it out. It is on its face the most powerful, has a lot of very straightforward combinations, and looks incredibly solid. Now, we actually saw several pretty well scoring Aspect Hosts come out of the gate with good results from this last weekend. This included 4-1 results also at the Red Dragon GT and Okeanos GT. However, we see a lot of the same combinations being used in all of them. Now, before we dive into Dami Segun's list, let's talk about exactly what this detachment does. This detachment gives an alternative hit or wound rerolls of 1 to Aspect Warriors and the Avatar of Cain each time they're selected to shoot or fight. Typically, this will end up being rerolling hit rolls of 1, and it has a lot of really powerful effects that go alongside hit rolls, including enhanced criticals, special critical effects, and stuff like that. There are also a lot of opportunities to take torrent weapons in Eldar in general, and so getting wound rerolls of 1 on those weapons is also pretty useful. Now, the number one combination in here is Preternatural Precision. This is a shooting phase enhancement and allows one of your Aspect Warrior units when it fires to gain either ignore cover, lethal hits, or sustained hits, or if it has an Aspect Shrine token, it can remove 1 to gain 2 of those abilities. So you can be gaining both lethal hits and sustained hits, and also gaining hit rerolls to roll into those results, and also potentially automatically converting to those results if you have additional Aspect Shrine tokens available. So in some instances, you can be getting 5 up criticals with lethal and sustained, 1 automatic success alongside hit rerolls to try to fish for additional successes. And when you're talking about units like Fire Dragons or Dark Reapers, this combination can represent an enormous amount of damage. And that's what Dami is doing in this Aspect Host. The army is including an Autarch with a Reaper launcher, as well as an Autarch Wayleaper. Now, the Autarch Wayleaper has been changed quite a bit. If you remember previous incarnations of the lone operative Autarch Wayleaper, who acts as a CP battery and a utility unit, those days are over. Instead, this guy can now attach into the faster Aspect Warrior varieties. That includes Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders. In this case, we do have several units of Warp Spiders in the army, so it's likely that he is able to attach into one of those and both enhance their melee output by contributing his Starglaive, but also he gives you the ability to regenerate battle focus tokens and give you free stratagems when used on that unit, making them very efficient to run. Now, the standard Autarch running the Reaper launcher is an attachment into one of the Dark Reaper units that's also in the army. He's similarly gonna give you a free stratagem, which you can use to, for example, re-embark his unit into a transport at the end of the fight phase. So we have Wave Serpents in the army, we can hop out his unit, fire with them, buff them up with stratagems. He also contributes an additional Reaper launcher attack that's a Strength 10 AP2 Ignore Cover 3 damage gunshot to the unit, benefits from all of their combos and synergies, and then for free puts them back into their transport. So that's a very efficient combination as well. In addition to that, we are also bringing Fuegan. He's going to attach into a unit of Fire Dragons. He himself has a massive damage output, especially when you are combining things like lethal and or sustained hits on his gun. His Seer Song with its lance attack comes in at Strength 14, Melta 6. So if you're able to sustain hits with that, and once he's attached into a Fire Dragon unit, he can use their Aspect Shrine token to automatically convert his hit rolls into 6s if he wants to. He's also going to be benefiting from the unit's built-in rerolls to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles. So that is going to be a high efficiency, super high damage unit that also is going to get the extended range that Fuegan is contributing with his leadership ability. So they're firing at somewhere around an 18 to 24 inch range between the fire pikes from Fuegan and the Exarch in the unit. unit, and then an 18-inch range from the fusion blasters on the regular fire dragons. That means they're going to melt up to 9 inches or 12 inches respectively, and get full hit and wound reroll. So that is a huge amount of damage. Plus, Fuegan's also incredibly strong in melee, so he can really act as a bit of a late game answer as the game progresses. Lycus is also included. This is the Warp Spider Phoenix Lord, the brand new Phoenix Lord for the army. She gives the unit the ability to flicker, jump, and then charge. So they can act as an incredibly strong movement blocker, or they can tag enemy units, but she can also be used to access this 5-up critical hit combo. So what you can do with this unit is push them super far forward, 24 inches with a flicker jump. You can fire their spinners at whatever you need to, give them wound rerolls because they're torrent weapons, so they don't need to get the reroll to hit. Then fire Lycus's twin-linked torrent somewhere else, benefit that unit with the 5-up criticals because she will just turn that on as long as she hits something with her ranged attack. Then you can pop out, for example, a Fire Dragon unit or a Dark Reaper unit, benefit from those enhanced criticals, give them lethal, maybe even sustained hits if you want to spend the Aspect Shrine token, and blow away that unit, then charge Lycus's unit into something light and blow that away too. So she can sort of enable this huge amount of alpha strike, enormous amount of value. Her unit's moving 24 inches and doing this, so they're going to be engaging and blocking a lot of your army, all the while you're being blasted by these Dark Reapers that you can't really fire back on because they're going to be hiding in Wave Serpents. So in order to enable that combination, we have 2 Wave Serpents to carry around our big gun units. We have 3 units of Dark Reapers, 1 unit of 10, and 2 units of 5. Almost certainly the Autarch is jumping into the 10 model Dark Reaper unit. The 5 model Dark Reaper units, they're all equipped with Tempest Launchers, so they have indirect fire weapons. So they may be standing in the back line and just picking away at opposing utility, or they could be being housed by the second Wave Serpent and then popping out and using the Reaper Launchers to attack aggressively into heavy targets. We can also use the Wave Serpents to deliver units like our Fire Dragons. We have 3 units of Fire Dragons or Howling Banshees. We have a big unit of 10 as well as a smaller unit of 5, and I would imagine almost certainly the big unit of 10 gets delivered by that Wave Serpent, and it can then embark other ranged units to protect them or to project their threat up the table later on in the game, or vice versa. So we can start, let's say, 2 units of Fire Dragons inside the Wave Serpent. We can disembark them, push them up either to destroy a tank or to hide in an aggressive position, then dump the Howling Banshees in, and then swap them around as you need to. We also have another unit of 5 Howling Banshees, 2 units of Striking Scorpions. That's going to be able to open up a lot of table space with their infiltration, so they are excellent utility units. They're excellent infantry sweepers, very good at killing light infantry, which is something that the army doesn't necessarily do otherwise. We have the Tempest Launchers for good indirect fire. The Howling Banshees are anti-infantry, but they are low attack volume, multi-damage, so they're good against medium to heavy infantry units. So if you're fighting a lot of Space Marine equivalents, Howling Banshees are great, but they aren't going to have the attack volume to fight through large hordes of models. Striking Scorpions, however, do have that. And then we also have those 3 units of Warp Spiders, so we're going to be able to push those guys up the table too. So it's an enormous number of light infantry. Almost all of the Aspect Host builds are being played very similarly. Basically, all of them are slamming 3 units of Dark Reapers and 3 units of Fire Dragons into their composition, and then the melee component is a little up in the air. Oftentimes we'll see Striking Scorpions, oftentimes we'll see Howling Banshees. Some lists are even including Jane Czar in order to further buff up our larger Howling Banshee units, and then we have some Warp Spiders, largely for utility, but also for their just speed and their ability to deal flamer damage to their opponent. Now, if I was expecting to see Eldar in a tournament anytime soon, this is a style of build that I would be trying to tech against. I think this is probably, at least from the outset, the scariest build that Eldar are bringing to the table. It is a huge number of 5 model independent units, so it's difficult to kill in individual activations. You have to have a lot of small activations that are able to clip out a lot of these little 5 model units very effectively. You have to be able to kill them in one hit, otherwise they're going to fade away and they're going to jump back behind line of sight blockers or back into their Wave Serpents, and oftentimes they're just going to be re-embarking into their Wave Serpents at the end of their fight phase anyway, so you have to be able to deal with the Wave Serpents with their transhuman effect and their invulnerable save, take those down, and then get a beat on the Dark Reapers or the Fire Dragons or whatever's hiding inside them, which the Eldar player is going to make as difficult to pin down as possible. Now, while I say that Aspect Host is probably the scariest list that we will see over the course of this weekend, it's certainly not the only one that saw play, because we saw a huge variety of other Eldar detachments do fairly well. And the next one I want to talk about is Windrider Host. We're going to go over to the Duke City Games GT, which was a smaller event, only 18 players, that was held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This one was won by Adrian Lopez, who was running this Windrider Host attachment. Now, for those who don't know, Windrider Host is the mounted and Viper focused attachment that has huge benefits for these light jet bike and light vehicle style units. It gives you two separate reserve effects. First of all, you can start units in reserve that then can strategic reserve on from the start of the game. So you can actually be strategic reserving onto your opponent from the top of the first turn. In addition, from future turns onward, you can up down your units at the end of your opponent's turn, placing them into strategic reserve and then bringing them in off a table edge normally. You're actually able to pop in right off the bat. And so this army has the capacity to play insanely aggressively. It also has huge benefits for these mounted units. We have things like +1 AP when shooting for mounted units, advance and fall back and charge with mounted units, a 7-inch move after destroying an enemy, either in melee or with ranged attacks, 4+ invulnerable save. So you can be fast, you can be hard hitting, and you can also be defensive and evasive with these units, which is a huge number of benefits for these guys. Now, what are we taking in the detachment in specific? Starting at the top, we have a Farseer Skyrunner with Echoes of Ulthanesh. This is a CP generator effect that allows you to gain command points on a 5+, but you gain bonuses based on where the Farseer is in relation to your deployment zone. If they're outside your deployment zone, you'll get +1. This also, I believe, works if they enter strategic reserve thanks to the detachment ability, which is cute, but they'll also gain an additional +1 if they are within your opponent's deployment zone, so you're incentivized to play this guy very aggressively. Now, also included in the army is a Warlock Skyrunner, and I have a sneaking suspicion that we're going to be attaching the Farseer Skyrunner to a large unit of Windriders here. So we can grant that unit an automatic 6 on an attack roll thanks to the Farseer Skyrunner, and they're equipped with shuriken cannons. So they're going to be getting a hit reroll if your target is on an objective thanks to the Windrider ability. Flipping one of those into an automatic 6, you can potentially gain +1 AP from the stratagem, and thanks to the attached Warlock Skyrunner, you can also be ignoring cover. So the damage from this unit is pretty phenomenal. Now, we also have some additional ways to strip cover because we are also including a unit of Shroud Runners, 3 Shroud Runners in that unit. Those guys are also going to be benefiting the units of Skyweavers that are also in place here. There are 3 units of Skyweavers, 2 units of 2, and a unit of 4. Now, interestingly, the Skyweavers themselves won't benefit from most of the detachment. In fact, I think the entire detachment triggers on Azyr mounted only, which is explicitly the Craftworld Eldar jet bikes. It precludes the Skyweavers themselves. However, when we're playing an army like this that's going to be trying to play as aggressively as possible, taking additional units that kind of fit that game plan also makes sense. So these guys kind of just fit the mold, I think, more than have any explicit synergies. We can save our detachment abilities and our command points to use on the actual Azyr mounted units, but the Skyweavers there along for the ride in order to add additional bodies to this kind of jail that the army's trying to construct. Now, speaking of that jail, we have 2 units of Striking Scorpions, so we have a lot of infiltration. They can infiltrate pretty far forward, scout forward, move block enemies, and potentially clear out enemy screens. We then have 3 units of Shining Spears, 6 Shining Spears apiece, and those guys are good both with pretty solid short-range shooting, but also incredibly good at melee. They have anti-monster, anti-vehicle, lance, 3 damage melee attacks, 19 attacks in total for the entire unit of 6 guys, so they're likely to knock out whatever they're coming into, and especially if you can do a little bit of damage with the Skyweavers or the Windriders or the other ranged attacks in the army before they go in, the Shining Spears have a pretty good chance of getting the killing blow. That also then allows them to move 7 inches with overflight. They can move through obstacles. They can buff their movement with battle focus. So it's very difficult to block yourself from being charged by the Shining Spears. They have an incredible amount of maneuverability. And if you begin them in reserve, you can use the detachment ability to rapid ingress them in on the first battle round. Because their ability to come in a round earlier is not restricted to their movement phase, they can just enter strategic reserves earlier than normal, which allows you to kind of play a very similar game to like a Stormlance Task Force Space Wolf list, where you start by jumping Shining Spears onto your opponent. You have so much midboard control from the Striking Scorpions and the Shroud Runners already, but then this Shining Spear unit comes in, hammer blows part of your opponent's army, prevents them from moving, and that allows you to then set up your large brick of Windriders, plus your smaller. There are 2 units of 3 Windriders in the army as well that can act as utility units, so they can jump in and perform actions and score secondaries for very few points. And that then allows you to set up your other Shining Spear units in positions where they can come in and hit on subsequent turns, as well as the Skyweavers, which have that anti-vehicle devastating haywire cannon shot, so they're able to apply additional damage to heavier targets. And then they can go in as well with their 2 damage melee attacks, and they can sort of continue to contribute to this wave attack where we're sending in a Shining Spear unit, Skyweavers, more Shining Spears, more Skyweavers, and keeping our opponent battered and in the corner while you just score out the secondaries for the entire game on your side of the table. This army looks absolutely terrifying to play against. Every time I look at these new Eldar armies, the number of units that they're able to include is wild, and while they are each individually not super duper powerful, once their combinations are enacted, they do seem like they're going to get a ton of work done. We also have a ranger unit in the army for additional utility, as well as 2 Shadow Weaver platforms, so that we can use to knock out enemy light infantry that's screening their backline, for example, because those are pretty solid indirect fire weapons. So we can, even before the bikes go in, and if our opponent has enough stuff to try to block the bikes from getting to the perfect position for them, we can be picking away at those units and opening up spots for the bikes to jump in with maybe their 6-inch deep strike stratagem to get in positions in order to perform secondaries or threaten our opponent's units, especially with that big unit of Windriders being able to jump in closer than normal to enemies with the big shuriken cannon volley with ignore cover, extra AP, auto 6s, rerolls, and all that stuff. Those guys can do some serious damage just by themselves. So this army looks absolutely insane. I'm so excited that Windrider Host is going to see some play, and I also wonder if there is maybe an argument for it over Aspect Host, because it's a little bit more resilient than Aspect Host to a lot of the stuff that I think people are going to be taking in order to defeat armies like that. Aspect Host is focused very heavily on these very low toughness, low wound count units. We have these Aspect Warriors that are coming in with 5 or 6 wounds a unit, and light indirect fire shooting is going to be pulverizing them. However, with the mounted focus, we have 2 and 3 wound models basically across the entire board. They're all toughness 3. And while their saving characteristics are pretty similar, so you don't really get a benefit there, you're not really losing as much efficiency out of your units quite as quickly by just getting hit by things like mortars and small units. And even once you get that Farseer up into your opponent's army and you start to misfortune those big indirect fire platforms, you can actually make your toughness 4 units a little difficult to kill. I don't want to mislead anybody by saying that I think Eldar units are going to be difficult to kill, but I do think it is much more difficult to knock out a significant number of Windriders than it is, for example, some Aspect Warriors that are only 1 wound apiece. Now with that, we're going to move over to some X and 1 results, so Eldar lists that did pretty well, but that weren't necessarily undefeated. And we're going to start with the Down Under Dawnbringer GT, a GT down in Australia that saw a 4-1 result from Christopher Wright, who was playing Warhost. Now, Warhost is kind of the evolution of the Battle Host index detachment. However, it's been very much retooled. It now gives you additional battle focus tokens and gives you additional bonuses when using battle focus tokens. You get an additional +1 to movement when using Swift as the Wind. You also gain +1 to your battle focus movement rolls. So if you have, for example, Fade Away, which allows you to move D6 in response to being targeted by an enemy, that would then allow you to move D6 +2 instead of the normal D6 +1. So we're playing a lot more of a finesse maneuver-oriented game plan than we are engaging with a little bit more of a straightforward fight like we would with an Aspect Host, for example. Now, the other benefit that this attachment has is that it gives you access to multiple ways to move after shooting. So we have Fire and Fade, which allows an As-Yuryani infantry unit to move D6 +1. It isn't a battle focus move, so you don't get the additional bonus from the detachment ability, but you can do so after shooting, and you can even get into a transport. In addition, we also have Skyborn Sanctuary, which is also duplicated in Aspect Host, which allows you to get into a transport at the end of the fight phase. So we can, for example, move 2 transports forward, disembark 2 units. One of them shoots and Fire and Fades and gets back in the transport transport behind them. The other one, you wait till the end of the fight phase, they Skyborn Sanctuary at the end of your turn, get back in that transport, and then your opponent has to try to kill those transports to get at the units inside to actually stop them from attacking, which is probably going to be a little difficult. Now, what are we taking in this detachment? First off, we have Azurman. Now, Azurman gives you an option for a third shoot and scoot kind of effect. He allows his Dire Avenger unit to move after shooting naturally. While you can't fire and fade that, you are just getting the ability for free. He also has a once per game wombo combo where he's able to turn his weapons into 3 damage devastating attacks. When you combine that with things like rerolls as well as the Aspect Shrine tokens from the Dire Avenger unit that he's going to attach into, his damage output goes absolutely insane. So he's able to inflict somewhere around 9 mortal wounds to most targets in the game pretty reliably. We also have an Autarch with a Reaper launcher, as well as Fuigen. We've talked about these guys in the past, not too much exciting happening here, as well as, interestingly, Eldrad Ulthran. Now, Eldrad is an interesting character in the new Codex. He has his Doom effect, which will give you +1 to wound against an enemy unit, but he also, if he's on the battlefield, just generates you command points. And given how many command points we're going to be burning in this detachment to keep our units from being shot by opponents, he is going to be a very necessary inclusion. So I think oftentimes he's going to be hanging out on the battlefield and generating you that CP. He can also even, if he moves up and attacks aggressively, he has an 18-inch range Mind War attack if he wants to use it. Even if he misses that attack, he can use Fire and Fade to get back behind line of sight blockers, so he can actually play a little aggressively, get Doom on enemies, and then keep himself safe with that Fire and Fade if you're not using it anywhere else. And that then allows you to benefit from that +1 to wound, basically army-wide. But I think oftentimes he's also just going to be trying to gain that effect in the late game. Now, he has a Warlock Conclave in the army that he's likely to be attached into. That gives him another, essentially, 4 ablative wounds with the 4+ invulnerable save, and gives his unit -1 to be wounded, which makes him a little bit tougher to scalpel out with indirect fire, for example. Following that up, we also have 2 Wave Serpents, as well as a unit of 10 Dark Reapers. They're going to likely attach in with the Reaper Launcher Autarch for the same combination that we talked about with Aspect Host. You don't get as much damage output from them because they're not getting hit rerolls. However, you do get more opportunities to place them back into their transport. We can use Fire and Fade potentially to jump them back in the transport if we need to. We have another unit of 5 Dark Reapers. These guys, interestingly, are equipped with a missile launcher on their Exarch, not a Tempest launcher. So we're not using them to indirect fire. We're actually just using them as an anti-tank fire platform if we need to. So imagine we're kind of acting as a little bit more of a long-range fire dragon unit with those guys. We have another unit of 10 Dire Avengers. Those guys are going to hang out with Azurman and jump in and out of a Wave Serpent as they're attacking, plus 2 units of Fire Dragons, 2 units of Howling Banshees for some infantry killing, plus a ton of utility. 2 units of Warp Spiders, as well as 2 units of Striking Scorpions, a unit of Rangers, and a unit of Shroud Runners. The Shroud Runners are particularly important in this variety because we are going to be focusing so heavily on Dire Avengers. While Fire Dragons have a relatively high AP to begin with, and Dark Reapers naturally ignore cover, Dire Avengers only come in at AP 1, and while they do have a pretty impressive volume of attacks, especially when shooting into something like a 3+ save that's going to be benefiting from cover, a lot of times they're going to be bouncing outside of Azurman's 1-turn Super Saiyan ability where he's going to just nuke down an infantry unit very quickly. So getting access to that ignore cover from the Shroud Runner unit, just for those Dire Avengers to get some work done, is going to be huge. Now, the Dire Avengers are also going to be particularly effective in the late game once we start benefiting them with Doom. That puts them on 5s to wound most, even heavy targets, and we can improve their critical hits to a 5+ with blitzing firepower. So once we start wounding a lot of heavy targets on 5s or even 4s when it comes to Azurman's guns, depending on the toughness characteristic, and getting sustained hits on a 5+, these guys can actually put a ton of work in, even against really heavy stuff, and then run back into safety thanks to Azurman's ability. So likely we're going to try to use long threat range units like the Howling Banshees and our utility units like the Striking Scorpions and the Rangers to score secondaries and score objectives and force our opponent to come into the Eldar army. We also have that Tempest launcher that's going to be poking at them as well to try to encourage them to come forward and attack. As they do so, you're going to be able to sort of nickel and dime them away with just the massive number of reactive moves that Warhost has access to, and then as things kind of come down to a point, Eldrad can start playing a little bit more aggressively, and he can start using his doom on enemies, firing fading himself to safety, and then you can kill those units with these Dark Reaper and Dire Avenger bricks. What's interesting is that I think these armies are very good at killing really big, hefty enemy units because they're going to be able to kind of engage them without really suffering any reciprocation. But I am interested to see how they interact with other Eldar armies that are going to be giving them just small units that are able to hit well above their weight class into the larger, big 10-man Dire Avenger and Dark Reaper squads without really giving them anything meaty to chew on, which these armies really want to be seeing. You want to see like a big knight run into the middle of the table so you can doom it and drop a bunch of fire dragon shots into it or something. You're less excited about seeing 5 striking scorpions come in and like blow out 10 Dire Avengers or something with their huge volume of attacks and sustained hits and all their benefits. Now, next up, let's move over to an army that I'm really excited to talk about because I did not expect to see this army see too much competitive play, because I did talk a little bit of smack about the detachment ability of this army when the Codex was first released, but we did see it do fairly well. This is Seer Council, which was taken to the Dark Sphere February GT, relatively large GT, and run by Tim Lowes. Now, Seer Council has a really interesting detachment ability. It allows you to roll up to 6 dice in a Strike Force game at the beginning of the first battle round. The facing on those dice gives you access to a 1 use of a free stratagem based on that number. So you basically go down the list of stratagems in the detachment. You essentially count down the stratagems that are in the detachment is how the chart ends up working. But essentially each of these dice will give you a free command point once during the game that you must use on one of those stratagems. Although there are some ways to manipulate the facings of the dice. Now we are also taking a mass of Phoenix Lords in this list. So we're memeing it up a little bit with enormous numbers of Phoenix Lords. But the big benefit that this army has is the Unshrouded Truth stratagem, which allows you to, in your movement phase, redeploy one of your units 9 inches away from enemies. So you could use this as a very aggressive reposition. You can use it to redeploy your utility units once you know what your secondaries already are. So you are very good at actively scoring your secondaries. And you can do that for free using fate dice, assuming that you have rolled the requisite number. So we're taking, I believe, all of the current Phoenix Lords in the Codex: Azerman, Baharoth, Fuegan, Janzar, Lycus. I think that's all of them. I guess Maugan Ra. We're missing Maugan Ra, actually. But otherwise, we have every single Phoenix Lord here. We're also taking Eldrad Elthran. So we just talked about him. A lot of the stratagems in this detachment require an Azuryani Psyker unit within range or within your unit in order to use it. So having Eldrad to generate UCP so you can use even more of these stratagems more often, but also be in a position kind of in the center of your army to enable any of these stratagems when you need them is super useful. We also then have a standard Warlock. He's equipped with the Lucid Eye, which allows you to switch the facing on one of your fate dice in your command phase up or down by 1. And I believe this is repeatable. So, for example, if you don't need to use any of your fate dice in one of your command phases, you can switch one of them to a better facing, and then the next turn switch it again to continuously kind of maneuver all of your fate dice into being able to use useful stratagems. Now, the Warlock can also double attach in with Eldrad, because Eldrad's a Farseer keyworded character, so he can come in alongside the Warlock. So we could have both Eldrad and that Warlock attach into a Guardian Defender unit that we have in the army that has a Bright Lance. That also gives you 1 big bank of infantry that you can use Psychic Shield on to make them untargetable outside 18 inches. So you can kind of hold down your backline and even be very difficult to engage with, even by indirect fire platforms. You can make them unshootable. We then have a unit of 5 Dire Avengers. These guys are particularly impressive alongside the Seer Council because they're going to attach in with Azermen. They're going to redeploy using Unshrouded Truth, fire their weapons, and then move. So you can use them to sort of movement block or take objectives, or even reposition them into weird positions around the table and then move them out of line of sight behind ruin walls and things like that, which is pretty impressive. We have a unit of 10 fire dragons, a little bit of overkill maybe, I don't know, but we don't have necessarily the same benefits that we have in armies like Aspect Shrine to supercharge these guys' damage output. We can give them ignore cover if you have a nearby Psyker model with Fate Inescapable, which is probably the best benefit that we have for them, but still they're likely to kill basically any heavy target that they shoot at, or maybe even 2, which might be kind of the point because we can use Unshrouded Truth to get them kind of perfect setups. which is going to be even easier to do since we have Fuegan to increase their weapon range. We also have 5 Howling Banshees for Jane Zar to hang out with, 2 units of 5 Rangers, a unit of 5 Striking Scorpions, unfortunately no Phoenix Lord for those guys, old Karandros got left behind, a unit of 5 Swooping Hawks to jump in with Behareth, as well as 5 Warp Spiders, a pair of Warlock Skyrunners in a Windrider unit. These guys aren't able to use Unshrouded Truth, but they are relatively fast, and that's going to give you a pretty solid capacity to follow around the units you're teleporting around the table with Psychers to then buff them with your Psyker stratagems. The Warlock Skyrunners also have a pretty solid torrent weapon as well, and they will give the Windriders ignore cover, so they're gonna be a pretty effective shooting platform regardless. And last but certainly not least, we also have a Falcon.
The Falcon actually has a particular synergy with the Azraman and Dire Avenger brick. Because he has that shoot and scoot, the unit's able to fire and then re-embark into that transport every time they attack. And when he uses his Devastating Wounds effect, getting any sort of wound rerolls on his weapons allows you to convert even more of those, and that's really where that guy starts to do absolutely incredible damage.
And overall, this army's absolutely wild. I love the fact that we're taking all of the different Phoenix Lords. I think this is going to be a very high finesse army, as we're talking about with most of these, but this one in particular, because we have the additional requirement that we have Psychers nearby our infantry units to buff them with our stratagems. Most of the stratagems do require that you have a Psyker within 9 inches of you. However, the ability to constantly be redeploying these big, powerful, ranged infantry units into really annoying positions, and then protecting them either with Psychic Shield to make them unshootable, or with Fade Away to move them in response to shooting, or even just with things like their own built-in abilities like Asherman's Shoot and Scoot, in order to keep those units alive in really inconvenient positions on the table for your opponent, where they can then continuously score points. We also have things like the little 5-man Ranger squads, we have the little Striking Scorpion squads, and stuff that you're okay with throwing out into aggressive positions to score secondaries. And as I mentioned before, the big benefit of Unshrouded Truth is that we're able to see our secondaries before we elect to use the stratagem during the movement phase. So you have total control over where your utility units are when you are performing your actions and things, which most uppy downy effects in the game actually don't do. I think the only other one that works in a similar way to this is, I believe, the Umbralific Crystal from Thousand Suns, but there are very few other ways to redeploy your units on your own terms. Most of the time you have to use them before you know what your secondaries are. So this army is very good at scoring. It has the capacity to alpha strike your opponent really heavily with that stratagem, and it has a bunch of really interesting defensive stratagems to keep your guys alive on the crackback too, which makes these big bricks of aspect warriors kind of annoying to engage with. Now with that, we're going to move back over to the Brighton GT, where we talked about aspect host earlier, and we're going to talk about the Ynnead detachment. This is the last list we have to discuss, and it's very different than the other Eldar detachments because obviously you get access to Ynnead units. So this is David Bannister, who went 4-1 at the Brighton GT using Devoted of Ynnead. Now, I know there's going to be a bunch of comments that say down below, oh, it's pronounced Ynnead. And first of all, Ynnead sounds cooler. And second of all, please keep commenting because it increases my engagement. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Now, this detachment precludes you from taking a bunch of the really powerful stuff in the Codex. You can't take any epic heroes that are not Yvraine the Vicearch or the Incarn. And you must include either Yvraine or the Incarn, who becomes your army's warlord. However, you do gain access to not only Harlequins, but also to Ynnead Drukhari units. So you're able to take things like Incubi and transports like Venoms and Raiders that can embark those Drukhari. In addition, all of those Drukhari units gain battle focus, so they're all going to get the benefits of all the cool battle focus, speed enhancements, and reactive moves that normal Eldar units get. And they get the super powerful detachment ability, which may be one of the most powerful detachment abilities in all of 40k. It allows you to move at the end of your opponent's shooting phase if you lost any units during that phase. So if your opponent kills one of your units, you can move another unit out of charge range, or you can move another unit onto an objective, or you can move another unit into charge range yourself or into heroic intervention range. There's an insane number of ways you can utilize this. You can also replace your fade back maneuver with a surge forward maneuver, which allows you to move into engagement range with that fade away rather than what is typically used, which is going to be moving away from the attacker in order to try to get out of line of sight. So you can engage people after they attack you. You can also then, if you've lost any models, give your units fight first in the fight phase. And these all work very synergistically. If you are very adept at playing them, there are a million different ways that you can use these to mess with your opponent's game plan during their turn, and it's going to be a nightmare to play against. Now, what are we taking in this detachment in particular? We're starting with a standard Autarch as well as a Spirit Seer, and there is a unit of Wraith Guard and a Wraith Lord in this detachment as well, so we do have some units for the Spirit Seer to buff up. We have a Harlequin Troopmaster who's going to attach into a unit of Harlequins, plus an Archon and Yvraine. Carrying those to the table is a Star Weaver, which is going to be embarking the Harlequins and the Troopmaster, as well as 2 Ynnead Venoms, which are likely to transport around 2 of the Ynnead Incubi units that are included. The Ynnead Archon allows his Incubi to reroll either rerolls of 1s when his unit is at full strength and full rerolls if his unit is below starting strength. So you can actually get quite a bit of damage out of the Incubi, who are normally pretty low strength, but obviously that supplements that quite a bit. Yvraine has a similar effect. She grants you wound rerolls for any of your Eldar units that attack an enemy she's engaging that she chooses at the start of the fight phase. So that will affect her unit, and she can lead a Ynnead Incubi squad, which are going to get the benefits of that, assuming that's where she's going. But that will also affect your other units, and that is especially beneficial to units like the Harlequin Troop. Now, Harlequin Troops come with an enormous number of attacks. They have up to 5 attacks per Harlequin player, and in addition to 6 2-damage attacks from their Troopmaster. Now, automatically, every single Harlequin has devastating wounds built into all their melee attacks, which means gaining them wound rerolls makes them good at killing basically anything in the game. 5 Harlequin Troopers, in addition to a Troopmaster, they can give themselves hit rerolls of 1, and they're pretty good weapon skill regardless. Then gaining wound rerolls allows them to deal something around 10 to 12 mortal wounds to basically whatever they're touching. So we can set up situations where we get Yvraine into melee with something and string the Incubi to fight something else. We kill that something else with those models, and then Yvraine buffs up the Harlequin Troop against the second thing that she's engaging. The Harlequin Troop goes in and murders that too. We're then forcing our opponent to deal with all of these different units. If they ever attack them and don't kill them, you can either surge them forward to engage enemies, or at the end of the phase, move them back and re-embark them into transports. Yvraine's unit and the Incubi can even use the Venom ability to re-embark into their Venoms at the end of the fight phase, to force your opponent to kill more of your army before getting to your juicier units, which is just going to reposition the rest of your stuff into the best possible location. Following that up, we also have a Fire Dragon unit for some anti-tank shooting, 2 Fire Prisms to add some long-range shooting into the army. Since you don't have the same level of synergy with the Phoenix Lords that we do in other detachments, the Fire Prisms are actually a really good supplement for that, because they do have those 60-inch range guns that they're able to fire either with the really high reliability 6 damage attacks or the 2d6 blast profiles as well. Following that up, we have a unit of Howling Banshees, a unit of Shining Spears, who are excellent in combination with the end of shooting phase movement that you're able to gain from the detachment ability. So you're able to reposition these guys into really annoying positions on the table. Because it's a normal move, you can use their ability to move over terrain features so they can get up close and personal into your opponent's face and then set up for a push in the future turn. And the fact that their 14-inch base move gives them a huge amount of distance that they can travel with that. Between a move that your opponent triggers and your own movement phase, this unit can move 30 inches if you also include the benefit of Battle Focus, the additional 2 inches you can get from Swift as the Wind. So they can be moving 30 inches over intervening terrain features and then just like nuke your opponent off their home objective or something like that if you ever have that ability triggered. We then have a unit of Striking Scorpions for some utility, a single Warlock Skyrunner, who I imagine we're taking as kind of a utility unit. We don't have any attachments for that guy, but he does have a Destructor, so a Torrent weapon, which is kind of nice to have, and he's only 45 points, so he's one of the cheapest individual unit options in the entire Codex, and you can kind of use these guys to just throw them out and score secondaries as really cheap utility units, and bait your opponent into killing them so that you can then trigger your end of shooting phase movements, and a bunch of rape. Now, these guys are going to get the benefit of the Spirit Seer nearby, who's going to gain Lone Operative initiative from either the Wraith Guard or the Wraith Lord near him, but also give them +1 to hit, +1 leadership, and potentially sustained hits to that unit as well. That's likely going to be going on the Wraith Lord because he's going to be equipping 2 Bright Lances, so having those really high value attacks with sustained hits is super nice. He also gets reroll hits and wounds of 1 into a particular enemy keyword chosen at the start of the game, so he can reroll into those sustained hits. And with the ability to move at the end of your opponent's shooting phase, he can be very mobile, much more mobile than you would expect from these big ponderous guys. Now, on top of that, we also have, and I think this is a fascinating inclusion, a unit of Wraith Guard with D-Sights. Now, normally we see the Wraith Cannon, the big strength 14, AP4, D6+1 damage anti-tank gun from the Wraith Guard here, but this D-Scythe is a strength 7, AP3, 1 damage torrent weapon, and one interesting interaction we can use with this unit is actually using them to move forward if your opponent destroys any of your units. So let's say you're in a position where your opponent's going to charge you, so they want to come in and charge onto your objectives. However, they have to kill you out of a transport, or they have to kill one of your units beforehand. You can then move the Wraith Guard from a position of safety in the center of the table out into the open behind whatever they're going to charge into. If they then choose to charge, you can overwatch them with 5d6 strength 7 AP3 1 damage gunshots, which they maybe weren't expecting to get hit with previous to that charge phase because they set up in the movement phase assuming that there were no available overwatches on them. However, you have control over where your units move, so you can always put yourself in a position where you can reposition these really powerful flamer units into an annoying spot. Not to mention the fact that the Wraith Guard are relatively tough to kill. They're toughness 6 with a 2+ armor save, and you can regenerate them back into the unit with the Spirit Seer. So you kind of want them to absorb damage, be reduced below starting strength so we can start to use the Ynnead abilities on them, but then also we can regenerate them as the game goes on and just sort of keep them around as a mid-board bulwark. So this little package of the Spirit Seer plus the Wraith Lord, who's pretty good in this detachment to begin with, and in addition the Wraith Guard, is a pretty unique inclusion and has a particularly strong spot in the Devoted of Ynnead over most of the other detachments. Now, we haven't really seen too much play from the Wraith Construct detachment, but I'm sure as people start to unlock these Wraith synergies, they're going to start, those detachments and these combinations are going to start to see even more play. Personally, I'm terrified of Devoted of Ynnead. This detachment looks so difficult to play against. Being able to see 3 steps ahead and make sure you don't walk into any of the annoying options that your opponent has once you start to kill their units feels very difficult to me. Kind of what you want to be doing is leaving a lot of their units just very barely alive and allowing them to continually move around the table and then hoping that you can kill them in the future and they don't generate additional value, and then basically like kill all of them all at once in order to not give your opponent extra movement and extra effects. But if you don't kill their unit, then their stratagems and their abilities get more powerful because they tend to trigger off of having your units below starting strength. So it's kind of a catch-22. You don't want to kill their units, but also if you don't, they're going to be more effective against you. So there's really no winning in that situation. The one benefit is that they do lose access to a lot of those really stand-up powerful combinations that Aeldari typically have, but that's relatively small solace given how powerful some of these movement effects can be that the detachment has access to. But that is all of the Eldar armies that I wanted to talk about today. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this new codex and what you think about the armies that are seeing play out of it. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports me, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and folks who subscribe to me over on Twitch. I appreciate all of you. Everybody keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.